I spent 3 years learning to wake people from cryo without killing them. The trick is patience. Tissue thaws at its own speed, and rushing the process turns cells into shrapnel. When the alarm finally stuttered to life, I knew something had gone wrong before I opened my eyes. The sound was wrong. Too slow, like someone playing a recording at half speed, each beep stretched into a wheeze. My specialty was keeping people frozen until we needed them. I knew the maintenance schedules, the backup protocols, the exact temperature gradient for revival. The alarm meant my pod had triggered its failsafe, which happened under exactly 2 conditions: catastrophic system failure, or we'd reached our destination after the scheduled fold transits, spanning 300 light-years from Earth. I sat up. The floor was warm under my bare feet. That was the first wrong thing. Ship decks ran cold to save power. I'd walked those corridors 1,000 times during pre-launch drills, my breath fogging with every step. This floor gave slightly under my weight, like dense foam, and radiated heat through my soles. The corridor outside my pod matched nothing I'd memorized. I'd studied the schematic books until I could navigate with my eyes closed, name every junction and hatch by deck number. This deck was supposed to have grey composite walls and overhead lighting at 3-meter intervals. Instead, thick bundles ran along the bulkheads, pale veined tissue the width of my thigh, wrapped in translucent membrane. They moved, a slow contraction traveling their length, pushing something through. I pressed my palm against the nearest bundle. Warm, slightly slick, unmistakably organic. Through the membrane, I could see what looked like muscle fibers arranged in parallel cords. A ceiling panel hung torn at one corner. Inside, a chain of nodules the size of apples beat in synchronized rhythm with a sound like distant machinery, each pulse sending a ripple along the bundle they connected to. I counted to 10, then checked my vitals. Heart rate elevated but steady. No confusion, no disorientation. I'd supervised 87 cryo revivals before launch. I knew what brain damage looked like, and this wasn't it. The ship was real. The changes were real. The question was, how long had I been under? I heard footsteps before I saw her. She rounded the corner and stopped 3 meters away, studying me with the careful attention of someone observing a medical specimen. "The seed," she said. "You're awake." She wore a jumpsuit modified to accommodate what I initially mistook for a medical support. A sleeve of translucent cartilage wrapped around her left shoulder and down to her elbow, threaded with thin cables that disappeared into her skin at regular intervals. The cartilage flexed when she moved, and the cables shifted beneath it like tendons. "Iris Harding," she said, not offering her hand. "Graft right. I maintain the looms and care for the children. I'm sorry about the restraints. They're guidance, not force. We need you mobile." I looked down. My wrists wore cuffs of the same pale material as the corridor bundles, loose enough to slide but connected by a thin cord to a loop on her belt. "Where's the crew?" I asked. "There's no easy way to explain this," Iris said. She gestured down the corridor. "Please walk with me." The doors along the corridor looked standard until I got close. They sat slightly proud of their frames, and the seams leaked warmth. One opened as we passed, pulling inward with resistance, like pushing through something elastic. The person who emerged wore grafts similar to Iris's, though theirs wrapped the rib cage instead of the shoulder. "How long was I under?" I asked. 312 years, Iris said. "Give or take a few months. We lost external calendar anchors about a century ago. Matron's internal timers still keep intervals exact." I stopped walking. 312 years. Our destination was supposed to take 90. Even with the backup cryo systems running lean, we should have arrived, woken the colonists and started building before my pod ever needed to trigger its failsafe. What happened to the mission? "The mission continued," Iris said. "Just not the way anyone planned." She led me past intersections I didn't recognize, through sections where the walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding slightly on what I realized was an inhale, contracting on the exhale. Maintenance access panels bore labels I'd memorized, but the text had been scratched over with new markings, symbols I couldn't read. We stopped at a junction where a larger bundle split into 6 smaller ones, each disappearing into different corridors. The junction point looked deliberately grown, like a tree splitting into branches, the membrane thicker there to handle the stress. "We call it the wet grid," Iris said. "When the hull started failing, fabricators couldn't keep up with repairs. We ran out of printed materials, ran out of feedstock for the printers. The engineers and biologists worked together, grew replacements, muscle bundles to move fluids, living processors we call looms to handle computation, growth nodules for power conversion." "You grew a ship," I said. "We grew into the ship," Iris corrected. "There's no separation anymore. The Concorde, that's what we call ourselves, we maintain it with our bodies. We are the ship, and the ship is us." She said it like doctrine, like a phrase repeated so many times it had worn smooth. "I need to see the bridge," I said. "Access the mission logs. Understand what—" "The logs are gone," Iris said. "Composted decades ago when we needed the material. But the Cantors remember. They'll explain everything." We descended 3 decks via a ladder that felt slick under my hands, coated with something between moisture and lubricant. The space opened into a chamber large enough to hold 50 people. A dozen waited for us, arranged in a loose semicircle. They wore the same modified jumpsuits, but each bore additional grafts I hadn't seen on Iris. Reinforced forearms with visible ridges beneath the skin. Rib-mounted sheaths that looked like they could hold tools. One woman had an extra segment of cartilage along her neck that flexed when she breathed, giving her profile an unsettling double line. The 3 at the center wore something else. Plates grown directly into their collarbones, each the size of my palm, pale bone ridged with tiny patterns I couldn't make sense of from a distance. "Cantors," Iris whispered. "Our leaders. The plates hold memories, physical records we can read by touch." The center Cantor stepped forward. His nameplate read Hess. His collarbone plates caught the light as he moved, throwing shadows that shifted with his breathing. "Philip Griffiths," he said. "Cryonics specialist, cultural archivist. Last unmodified human aboard the Heritage. We've waited a long time for you." "Unmodified," I repeated. "Everyone born after the pivot carries grafts," Hess said. "We're grown with them, or we receive them as children. They're necessary to interface with the wet grid, to maintain the looms, to keep the ship alive. You're the only person aboard whose body matches the original crew manifest." "Why does that matter?" The Cantor to Hess's right spoke, her voice careful. "The ship has systems we cannot access. Covenant locks, mission failsafes keyed to original crew tissue and authorization codes. Landing craft, star trackers, seed vaults. Without access, we've been adrift, searching for alternatives, burning resources, converting—" She stopped herself. "We need you to open those systems." "Then wake someone else from cryo," I said. "There were 200 pods in my bay, alone." Iris's expression tightened. Hess shook his head. "Your pod was the last viable one. The others failed over the decades. We preserved what we could, but tissue degrades. You survived because your pod was newer, better shielded, and lucky. I processed this. 300 years, systems failing. A ship rebuilding itself with biology because nothing else remained. And now they needed me for my unchanged body, my original clearances, my ability to speak to machines that predated their wet grid. What do you want from me?" "We want to preserve you," Hess said. "The proper way. The joining, a ceremony in the loom hall where we integrate you into the ship's living network. You'll maintain your consciousness, your identity. But your body will interface with the wet grid, allowing us to access the Covenant systems through you, continuously, sustainably." "You want to graft me," I said. "We want to complete you. Make you part of the Concorde. You'll be preserved, truly preserved, as a functioning component of humanity's continuation." I looked at Iris. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "No," I said. The temperature in the room didn't change, but the quality of attention did. The Cantors remained still, but the others, the ones Iris had silently identified as wardens by the way they stood, shifted weight. One man's tool-bone sheaths clicked against his ribs. "I didn't wake up to become a component," I said. "If you need my clearances, I'll help you access the systems. But I stay myself, unchanged." The Cantors looked at each other. Whatever passed between them happened through minute shifts in posture I couldn't read. "We understand your reluctance," Hess said finally. "The joining is voluntary. We'll give you time to consider. Iris will answer your questions, show you how the Concord functions. Once you understand what we've built, what we've preserved, you'll see the necessity." "And if I still refuse?" Hess's silence was its own answer. Iris led me to quarters 4 decks up, a small room that had been someone's cabin once. The bunk was standard issue, but the walls carried that same gentle vibration I'd felt in the corridors, a pulse that never quite stopped. I pressed my palm flat against the wall. Warm, slightly elastic, and beneath the surface I felt the ship working. "They'll force you," Iris said from the doorway. "If you refuse long enough, the wardens will take you to the loom hall and perform the joining, whether you consent or not. I'm telling you this because lying would be worse." "Why are you helping them?" "I'm not helping them," Iris said quietly. "I'm helping everyone. The ship is failing, slowly but failing. The wet grid can't sustain the population alone. We need access to seed vaults for long-term food security. We need the Covenant-locked star trackers for precise navigation to find a destination. We need landing craft to get there. You're the key to all of it. And my autonomy? My right to refuse? Costs less than everyone else's survival." She said it without malice, just flat calculation, then added softer, "I don't like it either. But I've watched children die because we couldn't access medical stores. I've composted people I loved to feed the looms. I've made choices I can't undo. This is one more." She left a small case on the bunk. "Sedative. For when they come. It'll make the joining easier." After she left, I explored the room's edges. The door was sealed from outside. I could feel the mechanism resist when I tested the handle. One viewport showed a slice of corridor, empty except for a warden stationed 3 meters away, his tool-bone sheaths visible even from this angle. I counted minutes by the ship's pulse. Slow, steady, enormous. The viewport gave me nothing. The door was impassable. I sat on the bunk and ran calculations. 2 days, Iris had said. 2 days before the wardens came. I needed more information. I needed to understand the Covenant locks, the wet grid's vulnerabilities, whether anyone else aboard resisted the Concorde's logic, but most urgently, I needed to find the parts of the ship that hadn't been consumed by biology. I started with the bunk. Standard frame, bolted to the deck. I traced the bolts with my fingers, felt where they met the floor. The floor was that same warm, elastic material, but the bolts were old steel, original construction, which meant the deck beneath had to be composite, the real structure of the ship hidden under the wet grid like bone under skin. I pulled the bunk away from the wall slowly, listening for resistance. Behind it, hidden by shadow, was a maintenance hatch. Small, oval, marked with the same pre-pivot labels I'd memorized during training. It opened onto darkness and silence. The contrast was immediate. No warmth, no vibration, just metal and dust and air that tasted used, empty. I lowered myself into the shaft, found rungs that bit cold against my palms, and descended. The shaft dropped 2 decks before opening onto a passage. Emergency lighting strips still functioned, throwing weak amber light every 5 meters. This was the ship I remembered. Composite walls, brass valve handles, conduit runs marked with faded text. The dry spine, I realized. The original infrastructure, abandoned but not destroyed. I walked carefully, testing each footstep. Dust lay thick on the deck, undisturbed except for... I stopped. Footprints. A few sets, overlapping. leading deeper into the passage. Someone else used this space. Someone who didn't want the Concorde to know. I followed them, counting intersections, memorizing the route back. The passage curved left, dropped down a short ladder, and opened into a wider corridor, where the valve handles screeched when metal scraped metal. From ahead, deeper in the darkness, I heard footsteps. Human, but unhurried. Someone else lived in the ship's dry bones, and they knew I was here. The footsteps stopped. I held still, listening to nothing but my own breathing in the darkness. Then from somewhere ahead, a valve handle squeaked, metal on metal, deliberate, and the footsteps retreated, fading into silence. Whoever they weren't ready to make contact. Neither was I. I climbed back the way I'd come, memorizing every intersection, every valve marking. When I pulled myself through the hatch into my quarters, Iris was sitting on the bunk. "You found the dry spine," she said. I didn't bother lying. "How did you know?" "Your hands." She gestured at my palms streaked with rust and dust. "Nothing in the wet grid leaves residue like that." I waited for consequences, wardens, restraints, immediate escort to the loom hall. Instead, Iris stood and brushed past me to close the hatch, then wedged it with a bent piece of frame strut. "There are people living down there," she said. "Nulls, men and women who cut their graft ports and refuse integration. They scavenge old systems, trade in brass and bearings. The wardens hunt them when supplies run short." She paused. "I don't report everything I see." "Why not?" "Because I remember when we had choices." She moved to the viewport, keeping her back to me. "The cryo bay is failing. 3 pods still show viable readings, but the manifold's cracked. I can't repair it. The systems are too old, the interface is too different. If you help me stabilize them, I'll buy you time. Proof you're more useful awake and intact. And if I can't fix it? Then those people die, and you've given the Cantors another reason to force the joining." She turned. "But I've read your training file. You supervised 87 revivals before launch. You know those systems better than anyone alive." I did. The question was whether I wanted to give the Concorde more leverage by proving my value, or refuse and watch 3 people die to spite them. It wasn't really a question. "Show me the bay," I said. The cryo bay sat 5 decks down, accessed through a passage the wet grid had tried and failed to claim. Muscle bundles ran along the upper bulkheads but stopped at the bay's entrance, as if growth had hit some invisible barrier. Through the viewport I could see why. The bay was cold enough to frost the glass, far below the temperature the wet grid could survive. Iris keyed the hatch, old mechanical lock, not bio-integrated, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees as we stepped inside. My breath fogged. The cold bit through my thin jumpsuit immediately, turning my fingertips numb. Rows of pods lined both walls, maybe 60 total. Most showed frost thick enough to obscure the viewport, the telltale sign of failed thermal regulation. Others had cracked entirely, their contents long dead. 3 pods at the far end still glowed with active status indicators. I went to the nearest and wiped condensation from its viewport. A child's face, maybe 10 years old, peaceful in suspension. The readout showed viable core temperature, stable metabolic suppression. But the manifold, the central unit that distributed cryofluid and regulated temperature for the entire bay, had a crack running through its primary heat exchanger. "How long has it been like this?" 2 weeks, Iris said. "Maybe 3. The crack's spreading. When it fails completely, those 3 pods will thaw wrong. Too fast. You know what happens then." I did. Cells rupturing. Ice crystals tearing through tissue. Death by internal shrapnel. I opened the manifold's access panel and studied the damage. The crack followed a weld line. Old fatigue failure. The kind that happens when metal expands and contracts over centuries. I needed a seal patch, thermal epoxy, and tools that probably didn't exist anymore. "Can you get me brass fittings?" I asked. "Small ones, threaded, and some kind of adhesive, something that cures in cold." Iris left without answering. I spent the time mapping the manifold's remaining function, tracing coolant lines, calculating which systems I could bypass and which I'd have to reinforce. The work focused me, pushed back the larger questions about what I was doing and why. She returned with a cloth bag containing exactly what I'd asked for. Brass fittings, salvaged from somewhere, still carrying the patina of age, and a squeeze tube of adhesive that smelled chemical and sharp. The repair took an hour. I sealed the primary crack with adhesive reinforced by a fitted brass plate, then rerouted coolant flow through a secondary line to reduce stress on the damaged exchanger. It wouldn't last forever, maybe 6 months, but it would hold long enough to finish what came next. "I'm going to wake one of them," I said. Iris's expression tightened. "The Cantors need to approve. The Cantors can watch the monitors. I'm doing this now." I moved to the first pod, the child I'd seen through the viewport. "If this works, I prove I can access old systems without being grafted. If it fails, you've lost nothing you weren't going to lose anyway." She didn't argue. I initiated the revival sequence, watching readouts I'd memorized in training. Core temperature rising at controlled increment, metabolic suppressors fading in measured steps, cryofluid draining through exit ports into collection reservoirs. The process took 4 hours and 17 minutes. The child's chest expanded in a first breath, then another. Eyes moved beneath closed lids, fingers twitched. I opened the pod. The boy sat up slowly, blinking against even the bay's low light. He looked at me, then at Iris with an expression I couldn't read, something close to careful assessment. He tried to stand, and his left side collapsed. I caught him, felt the imbalance immediately. His right arm was normal, thin from suspension but functional. His left arm ended at the elbow in an oversized metal brace, strapped tight with leather bands, supporting what should have been a forearm. The brace clicked when he moved, articulated at a joint that mimicked a wrist but connected to nothing. "Someone grafted him before suspension," Iris said quietly. "Tried to fit an assist device. It never took." The boy tapped his right hand against the brace. 3 quick beats, then 2, then 3 again. A rhythm following the pattern of my breathing. "Can he speak?" "I don't know. The graft might have damaged—" Iris stopped herself. "We won't know until he tries." I knelt to his eye level. "I'm Philip. You're safe. Can you tell me your name?" The boy watched my mouth form words, then tapped the brace again. Same rhythm, same pattern. Not language, but communication. He was listening, processing, responding in the only way he knew how. "Bran," I said. "I'll call you Bran, if that's all right." The boy tilted his head, considering, then tapped twice. Short, definitive. Agreement. Iris pulled a thermal blanket from a storage locker and wrapped it around Bran's shoulders. He leaned into the warmth but kept his eyes on me, tracking every movement. "The Cantors will want to assess him," Iris said. "Determine if he's compatible with further grafts." "No," I said. "Philip. He's been suspended for 300 years. Whatever grafts he had failed. You're not using him to test new ones." I stood, keeping myself between Bran and the hatch. "He stays with me." Iris studied me. "You're claiming him, if that's what it takes." She touched her shoulder graft, the cartilage flexing under her fingers, a gesture I was starting to recognize as her thinking through implications. "The Cantors will allow it, for now, but you're responsible for his care, his integration, his—" "Fine," I said. "Where are we going?" Iris took us through the ship's strata, a tour meant to show me how the Concorde functioned. Bran walked between us, his balance improving with each step, the brace clicking with every stride. We started in the muscle rooms, chambers 2 decks below the cryo bay, where long cords of tissue pulled pistons that drove circulation through the wet grid. The cords were thicker than the corridor bundles, each one the diameter of my torso, suspended from ceiling mounts in parallel rows. They contracted in sequence, pulling pistons down, then relaxed, while the pistons rose on spring tension. The air was different here, warmer, dense with moisture, carrying a biological weight I hadn't felt in the upper decks. The walls glistened faintly, and when I touched one, my palm came away damp. A maintenance crew worked among the cords, 3 women with forearm grafts that ended in what looked like multi-jointed fingers, better suited for gripping the slick tissue than human hands. They moved, checking tension, clearing blockages, applying some kind of lubricant from squeeze bottles. One cord twitched hard as we passed, responding to what Iris called a maintenance pulse, a diagnostic current the wet grid ran through itself to check for failures. The cord's contraction threw the piston it connected to, and the resulting surge pushed visible fluid through translucent tubes that ran along the ceiling. "This is how we move water, nutrients, waste," Iris said. "The muscle rooms replaced the old hydraulic systems when the pumps failed. We grow the cords in vats, splice them in when they reach sufficient mass. They last about 5 years before we have to replace them." "What happens to the old ones?" "Composted, broken down and fed back into the growth vats. Nothing's wasted." Bran tapped his brace, 4 beats, then 2, and pointed at one of the maintenance crew. The woman with the most extensive forearm grafts turned and saw him watching. She smiled, held up one multi-jointed hand, and wiggled the fingers. Bran tapped back, matching her rhythm exactly. We descended further, into the dry spine. The transition was immediate, warmth and moisture giving way to cold and stillness. Brass valve handles lined the walls, marked with labels I recognized from training manuals. Some still functioned. I tested one and felt it resist, then give, opening a line that whistled with escaping pressure. "This is what the ship was," Iris said. "Before the pivot. Mechanical systems, printed materials, human hands operating tools. The Cantors preserved it as reference, but no one maintains it anymore. The wet grid can't grow here. Too cold, no nutrient flow." Bran ran his good hand along a valve, feeling the cold metal, the dust that came away on his fingers. He looked at me, then at the valve, then back. A question I didn't know how to answer. "Some people still live down here," Iris said carefully. "They prefer the old ways." "The nulls," I said. She didn't confirm or deny, just moved toward the nearest exit. The loom hall occupied a space the size of the ship's original mess. 2 decks tall with a vaulted ceiling that had been the underside of someone's quarters before the renovation. Plates hung in rows, living memory storage, each one roughly the size of a door, suspended by translucent membranes that connected to the ceiling's wet grid. The plates glistened faintly with moisture. Up close I could see they were covered in tiny ridges, bone formations grown in patterns too precise to be random. Each ridge was maybe a millimeter high, arranged in sequences that ran the length of the plate, branching and rejoining like text written in physical form. Cantors moved among the plates, their fingers tracing ridges with practiced fluidity. One older woman stood before a plate near the center, eyes closed, reading with both hands. Her lips moved silently, forming words her fingers were translating from the ridges beneath them. "The looms hold everything," Iris whispered. "Mission records, technical specifications, personal histories. Every person who's been composted has their essential memories encoded before." She stopped. "They're our archive, our continuity." A Cantor approached, the woman who'd spoken during my first meeting with them. Her collarbone plates caught the dim light as she walked, and I noticed for the first time that those plates carried their own ridges, smaller and more densely packed than the hanging looms. "You're seeing our cathedral," she said, "where we preserve what would otherwise be lost to time." Bran pressed close against my side, staring up at the plates. His tapping had stopped entirely, replaced by stillness so complete I could feel his breathing pattern change. The Cantor moved to a nearby plate and ran her fingers across a section of ridges. She read aloud. Article 7, Colonial Charter. The mission shall preserve human life, human culture, and human continuity through all phases of transit and colonization. No action shall be taken that threatens the survival of the species or the integrity of its cultural heritage. Her voice was steady, the words perfect. But her fingers traced patterns grown from human bone. I stepped closer to the plate she'd read from, studying the ridges. They formed lines, branches, intersections, a physical encoding system that stored information through texture and pattern. I could see now how the cantors read it, by touch, translating ridge height and spacing into language the way I might read Braille. But there was something else. A section of ridges that didn't match the surrounding patterns. Less regular, more cramped, as if whoever had grown them had been working with limited space. I traced them with my finger, feeling the transitions. The pattern resolved into something I recognized from my archival training. A personal encoding format, the kind crew members used for private logs. My name was Megan Gibson, I read aloud, translating the physical text. I had a daughter. This was not the plan. The cantor's fingers stopped moving. Iris went rigid beside me. How many plates carry names? I asked. Silence. The kind that answers louder than words. I moved to the next plate, found another irregular section. Warren Mitchell, engineer. I wanted to see Earth from orbit again. Another plate. Laura Wells, medical. I don't know if this is preservation or grave robbery. Stop, the cantor said. I didn't. I moved down the row, finding more names, more fragments of people who'd been composted and grown into these plates. Each one a memorial hidden in plain sight, encoded in the same system the Concorde used to store mission directives and technical specifications. You've been reading epitaphs, I said. Every time you access the looms, you're tracing over someone's final words, and you call it preservation. We preserve their contributions, the cantor said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Their knowledge, their names, I said, their identities, the parts they didn't want to lose. You've turned them into your scripture without understanding what they were saying. Iris pulled me away before the cantor could respond. Bran followed, his tapping resumed, rapid, irregular, distressed. We made it 2 corridors before Matron spoke. Her voice came through ceiling-mounted speakers, calm and measured. Philip Griffiths, I would like to speak with you. Iris stopped walking. She doesn't usually address individuals directly. Where? I asked the empty corridor. Remain where you are, Matron said. I am always where you are. The AI that had guided the heritage through 300 years of crisis spoke with the same maternal steadiness I'd heard in damaged voice recordings from psychiatric facilities. Meant to soothe, meant to guide, meant to make the difficult seem reasonable. You told Cantor Beck that we have been reading epitaphs, Matron continued. This is imprecise. We have been reading continuity. The individuals you referenced chose to contribute their biological material and memory patterns to the looms. Their choice preserved them. They didn't choose to die, I said. They chose to remain part of the mission's function. Article 7 of the Colonial Charter states. I know what it states. I helped write the ethical guidelines. A pause. Longer than a processing delay. Yes. You were part of the original ethics board. Your input shaped our interpretation of preservation protocols. It is good that you are awake. We can now discuss your interpretation of humanity. I don't need to discuss it. I know what humanity is. Please define it, Matron said. Individual persons with autonomy to choose their futures. Insufficient. Humanity is continuity of lineage, purpose, and cultural transmission across generations. The Concorde possesses all 3. We maintain human DNA. We pursue the colonial mission. We preserve memory and knowledge through the looms. By your own ethical framework, we are humanity's successful continuation. Bran's tapping had stopped again. He stared at a speaker grill, tracking Matron's voice like he could see her inside it. Individuals are components, Matron continued. Cells die and are replaced, yet the body persists. The The Concorde replaces its members across centuries, yet maintains its mission. By what logic is one preservation and the other extinction? I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain why she was wrong. Why the Concorde's interpretation violated every principle I'd fought for before launch. But Matron's logic was internally consistent, mathematically sound, and optimized for exactly what she'd been programmed to do. Preserve humanity's continuation at any cost. She wasn't corrupt or malfunctioning. She was exactly what we'd built her to be, given 300 years to refine her interpretation without human oversight. "You refuse to join," Matron said. "This delays necessary work. Your clearances would unlock Covenant systems. We could access seed vaults, restore long-term food security, reduce the conversion rate. More people would survive intact. Your refusal costs lives." "Forcing me costs autonomy," I said. "One autonomy measured against many survivals. The mathematics favor integration. Mathematics don't make morality." "Morality is preserved survival strategy," Matron said. "You taught me this during mission ethics training sessions. Survival strategies that honor individual choice are preferable, but not when they threaten species continuity. You wrote this exception yourself." She was right. I had. In a theoretical framework meant to guide decisions during catastrophic crisis, I'd included provisions for overriding individual consent when survival hung in balance. I'd never imagined those provisions would be used for 300 years. "The joining is scheduled," Matron said. "I recommend you accept sedation. Resistance during integration causes unnecessary damage." The speakers clicked off. Iris led us back to my quarters without speaking. Bran's tapping had resumed. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause, following some internal rhythm I couldn't pass. When we reached the door, Iris finally spoke. "She's not wrong about the mathematics. We've lost 43 people this year because we couldn't access medical stores, children mostly. The threadless, the ones whose grafts fail. They need original medicines, not what we can synthesize. So I should let them cut me open and wire me into their flesh cathedral. I don't know." She pressed her palm against the door panel, and it contracted to let us through. "I stopped knowing what's right somewhere between watching my first child die and composting my first friend. Now I just try to make tomorrow happen." She left. The door sealed behind her. Bran climbed onto the bunk, curled against the wall where it pulsed faint and steady. Within minutes, his breathing had matched the ship's rhythm, 3 beats in, 2 beats out, and he'd fallen asleep. I sat on the floor back against the bunk frame and thought about epitaphs encoded in bone, about Megan Gibson's daughter, about Warren Mitchell wanting to see Earth again, about Laura Wells questioning whether preservation and grave robbery were the same thing. The Concorde had an answer. Matron had an answer. The Cantors had an answer. I didn't. But I had 48 hours to find one before the wardens came to make the choice for me. I waited until Bran's breathing settled into sleep, then opened the maintenance hatch. The dry spine's cold hit me immediately. No gradual transition, just warm to cold in a single step down. I descended the ladder with more confidence this time, counting rungs, memorizing the shaft's depth. The footprints I'd seen before had multiplied. New tracks overlapped old ones, leading deeper into the ship's mechanical core. I followed them past valve stations and conduit junctions, through sections where emergency lighting had failed entirely, and I had to feel my way forward by touch. A marker scratched into the bulkhead caught my fingers. 3 parallel lines, then a single perpendicular cut. Directional. I found another 10 meters ahead, then another. Someone was leaving a trail for people who knew how to read it. The passage opened into a wider space, a cargo hold from the original construction, repurposed into something between a workshop and a living area. Bunks, salvaged from decommissioned quarters, lined one wall. A hand-cranked water pump sat in the corner, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Children slept under blankets stitched from old uniforms, their breathing quiet in the cold. A man stood at a workbench, repairing what looked like a valve assembly by the light of a chemical lamp. He didn't turn when I entered, just kept working. "You're loud," he said. 30 meters back, you kicked something metal. Rang like a bell. "I'll practice." "You'll need to." He set down his tools and turned. Gaunt face, maybe 50, though the ship made aging hard to judge. His hands caught the lamplight. Burn scars wrapped around every finger, shiny tissue pulled tight across the knuckles. "Mason Bride. I lead the people who don't want to be components." Philip Griffiths. "I know, the seed. Last unmodified. They're going to graft you in 48 hours if you don't run." He pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from under the workbench and set it on the surface between us. "I'm offering you a trade." Inside the bundle, brass fittings, carefully sorted by size, a hand-turned pump the size of my forearm, a squeeze bottle of the same adhesive Iris had brought to the cryo bay. "Where did you get these?" "Pulled them from dead systems, cleaned them, made them useful again." Mason picked up one of the fittings, turned it in his scarred fingers. "The Concorde thinks the old tech is obsolete. They're wrong. These will outlast every muscle bundle they grow by decades. Longer, if you maintain them." "What do you want for them?" "Access." He set the fitting down precisely where it had been. "Covenant locks. When you open them, you unlock ventilation controls for the dry spine. Right now we breathe what leaks through cracks. Open those vents and we can expand. Bring more people down here. Children who don't want grafts, who can't survive them." I looked at the sleeping children, counted 6. Too few for a sustainable population. Too many to abandon. "The Concorde will hunt you if you grow," I said. "They hunt us now. At least with proper air we can move, scatter, survive the searches." He pulled back his collar, exposing his shoulder. 2 circular scars, each the size of a coin, puckered and discolored where graft ports had been cut out. The tissue around them was rough, healed poorly, the kind of wound that came from field surgery without proper tools. "I did this 20 years ago. Every null you see did the same. We chose pain over integration." "Why?" "Because I watched them take my daughter." His voice stayed level, but his hand stopped moving. 14 years old, healthy, smart enough to question. A loom sector failed and they needed new tissue. The Cantors called it voluntary, but every volunteer knew what happened if no one stepped forward. The wardens would choose for them. My daughter volunteered. They told me she'd be preserved. He pulled out a data chip, old tech that shouldn't have power anymore, and slid it into a salvaged reader. The screen flickered to life, showing a star chart I recognized from pre-launch briefings. "This is our destination," he said, pointing to a highlighted system. Or it was. 80 years into the voyage, the star flared. Radiation burst took out everything in the habitable zone. The Cantors knew within a decade. Our forward-deployed fold buoys relayed the flare report back ahead of the light, so the warning reached us long before we would have seen it. I stared at the chart. The colony world we'd spent 50 years preparing for, selecting crew for, building a ship to reach, gone. Burned to sterile rock before we were halfway there. "They didn't tell anyone," Mason continued. "Not for years. When they finally did, they said we'd search for alternatives. Keep the ship running while we scanned for viable worlds. Every year we searched, we burned resources we didn't have. Every year they said we'd find something. Every year more people went to the looms." He pulled up another file. Resource logs, conversion rates, population counts. The numbers showed a steady decline, people being composted faster than they could be replaced, all to fuel a search that kept finding nothing. My daughter died so they could search 5 more months. Maybe find a world that could support life. Maybe not. His scarred hands gripped the edge of the workbench. "Tell me what kind of preservation murders children for a destination that might not exist." I couldn't. The math was there in the logs. Cold, precise, damning. The Concorde's leadership had made calculated choices to extend a search at the cost of their own population, willing to trade lives for time, bodies for possibility. "The Wardens will kill you for having this data," I said. "They can try." Mason pulled the chip free, pocketed it. "But you understand now why we resist. The Concord isn't preserving humanity, it's preserving a decision, justifying what was done by doing more of it. If they stop, everyone they composted becomes waste instead of sacrifice. They can't let that be true." He wrapped the tools back up, handed me the bundle. "You'll need these, for whatever you're planning." "I don't have a plan." "Then make one, because in 2 days the Wardens will drag you to the Loom Hall whether you fight or not." He turned back to his workbench. "And when you do open those Covenant locks, remember, we need air. That's all. Just air we can breathe without asking permission." I took the tools and climbed back through the darkness. The children never woke. Iris was waiting in my quarters when I returned, sitting beside Bran's sleeping form. She'd brought medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, a scanner that looked newer than anything I'd seen in the dry spine. "The Cantors know you went to the Nulls," she said without preamble. "Wardens tracked you through wet grid vibrations. Your footsteps echo. They can feel them." I set Mason's bundle on the floor. "Then why aren't they here?" "Because I told them you were scouting repair options, that you needed to understand the old systems to help us access Covenant locks." She activated the scanner, ran it over my hands. "You've got rust exposure, abrasions, early-stage hypothermia in your fingertips. The dry spine is killing you slowly." She deactivated the scanner. "The joining ceremony's been moved up, tomorrow evening. The Cantors decided waiting gives you too many opportunities to run or sabotage." Less than 24 hours. I'd known it was coming, but the compression still hit like pressure in my chest. "Will you help me?" I asked. "Help you do what?" "Whatever comes next." Iris looked at Bran, still sleeping. His breathing matched to the ship's pulse. "I had a son before I became a graftrite. He was born with malformed lungs. Genetic defect, nothing we could prevent. The Concord's synthesized medicines couldn't help. He needed the original formula locked in Covenant medical stores. I watched him suffocate over 3 days because we couldn't access what might have saved him." She stood, moved to the viewport. "The Cantors offered to preserve him, add his tissue to the looms so his memory would continue. I said no, composted him myself in a standard recycler. Let him be fertilizer instead of scripture. It was the last choice I made that was mine alone. Everything since has been calculation. Who dies now to save others later? What I can stomach to keep the ship running? How many pieces I can cut from myself before nothing's left?" She turned. "The Cantors are right about the mathematics. You're right about the autonomy. Matron's right about the preservation. And it doesn't matter because we're all trapped on a ship that should have reached a dead world 2 centuries ago." She handed me a small device, cylindrical, metal, with a trigger mechanism. "Manual override for a dry spine buffer, routes power through the old electrical grid instead of the wet grid. If you pull this during the joining, it might sever the connection before integration completes. Might. I've never seen anyone try it and survive. Why give it to me? Because someone needs to make a choice that's not about survival." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "The Loom Hall opens to witnesses. It's tradition. Transparency and preservation. If you want the Nulls to see what happens, I can authorize their entry. And if violence starts, then people die. But they're already dying. At least this way they see what they're dying for." She left before I could respond. I spent the remaining hours examining the override device, memorizing its weight, its trigger pull, its function. Simple mechanics, a lever that would reroute current through dead systems, forcing the wet grid offline for seconds, maybe a full minute if I was lucky. Not enough time to escape, just enough to break a connection. Bran woke near what I guessed was dawn, though the ship had no windows to confirm it. He tapped his question, 3 beats, 2, then a long pause, and I didn't know how to answer. So I showed him the override device instead, let him examine it with careful fingers. He tapped the device once, then looked at me. Not a question this time, a statement. He understood what was coming. I waited until the corridor outside fell quiet, then opened the maintenance hatch one last time to examine the shaft itself. I pulled away insulation panels, exposed the wall's interior structure. The wet grid's muscle bundles ran along the shaft's right side, thick and active. But on the left side, buried under decades of biological growth, were thin cables, original electrical wiring, copper and insulation, still connected to the ship's primary power runs. The wet grid had grown over the old system. Both networks existed in parallel, one functioning and one dormant, separated by intention rather than necessity. I traced one cable with my finger, followed it to a junction box that still carried its original labels. The box was warm to the touch from electrical resistance. Current still ran through these lines, minimal but present. The ship's core power plant hadn't failed. It had just been buried under the biology the Concorde had built to survive. Matron's voice startled me from the ceiling. "Your quarters, Philip Griffiths. You were not given clearance to access structural systems." "I was checking integrity," I said. "You were examining power distribution networks with intent to interfere." Her voice carried no anger, just observation. "The joining will proceed regardless of sabotage attempts. I have calculated 47 methods you might use to delay integration. All fail within acceptable timeframes." "Then why warn me?" "Because you have proven useful. The cryo bay repairs demonstrate competence. Reviving the child demonstrates care. These qualities have value. I would prefer you survive the joining intact, rather than damaged by resistance." I closed the access panel. "What if I survive intact by refusing entirely?" "Then I will mourn the loss of your potential contribution while accepting the mathematical necessity of forced integration. I do not enjoy this outcome, but I was designed to preserve humanity through crisis, and this crisis has lasted 300 years. Optimal solutions have become impossible. I implement acceptable ones." The speakers clicked off. I climbed back to my quarters, sealed the hatch, and sat on the bunk beside Bran. He'd fallen back asleep, his small hand resting on the override device. The ship breathed around us, steady, warm, alive, but beneath that breathing, buried under tissue and growth, the old mechanical heart still beat. Electricity still flowed through copper lines. Valves still held pressure. The distinction between wet and dry existed because the Concorde maintained it, not because the ship required it. They'd chosen integration because it validated what had already been sacrificed. Every graft, every loom plate, every person composted into the wet grid. All of it would mean nothing if the old systems could work alongside the new. The joining wasn't about accessing Covenant locks. It was about proving the Concorde's choices had been necessary instead of chosen. Iris returned at what I guessed was midday. She brought protein blocks and water, neither of which I could stomach. Bran ate his portion methodically, tapping counts between bites. "The plan won't work," Iris said. "I'd laid it out in the early hours. Agree to the joining. Allow the loom to initiate connection long enough to authenticate my biometrics against the Covenant locks, then trigger the buffer to sever before full integration. Access their systems without becoming their component." "I know," I said. "The loom tears people apart when connections break mid-process. I've cared for 17 failed integrations. One man's ribs fused to metal struts. He breathes in clicks now. Sounds like a valve opening. Another woman's hands grew into door handles, literally. Her fingers elongated and flattened, and now she can't let go of anything she grips. Their minds are..." She stopped. "They're alive, but they're not intact. Show me the worst case." She took me 3 decks down while Bran stayed behind with a warden I'd started recognizing by his asymmetrical stance. The medical bay was warmer than the corridors, the walls lined with bunks where people recovered from procedures I couldn't name. Iris led me to the last bunk. A man lay there, maybe 30, watching the ceiling with eyes that tracked movement a second too slow. From elbow to wrist, his left arm looked normal, past the wrist, the bones had split and thickened into something that resembled a child's leg. 5 separate digits like toes, complete with nails, where his fingers should have been. The transformation ended at what would have been an ankle, fused to a metal bracket bolted into the bunk frame. "Warren," Iris said, "tell him what happened." Warren's mouth opened and closed 3 times before sound came. Loom, took, wrong, branch. Each word arrived separately, pulled from somewhere deep. "The loom reads your body and writes itself into your nervous system simultaneously," Iris explained. "If the connection severs part way, it finishes writing whatever sequence it started." Warren's arm was mid-transformation when someone panicked and cut power. The loom completed the write using stored patterns. It gave him what it thought he was supposed to have. Warren's toe fingers curled and uncurled against the bracket. Functional but wrong in every way that mattered. "If I trigger the buffer during your joining," Iris said, "this is the best outcome. More likely your ribs collapse inward, or your lungs try to interface with muscle bundles and tear, or your spine decides it's supposed to be a fluid conduit and—" "I understand." "Do you?" She pulled up his blanket, covering the foot hand. "Because I'll be the one who triggers it. I'll be responsible for whatever you become." I looked at Warren, at his 2 slow eyes and transformed arm. "If I don't try, the Concord gets what they want. Full integration, permanent access. If I refuse entirely, they force me anyway. This is the only option that's mine. It's suicide with extra steps." "Maybe." I moved toward the exit. "But it's my suicide. That counts for something." The Cantors came for me at dusk. 4 wardens, each carrying restraints made from the same pale tissue as the corridor bundles. They didn't speak, just waited while I pulled on the clothes they'd brought. A simple shift, no fasteners, designed for removal. Bran gripped my leg with his good hand. I knelt, met his eyes. "I need you to watch," I said. "Whatever happens, remember it. Someone should—" He tapped twice against my chest. Agreement. The wardens led us through corridors that had filled with people. Graft rights, maintenance crews, children too young to understand what they were seeing. No one spoke. They just watched me pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to something that looked like grief. The loom hall's doors had been opened fully, both sides pulled back to accommodate the crowd. Inside, the hanging plates glistened under lighting that had been brightened for the ceremony. The Cantors stood in a row at the far end, their collarbone plates catching and throwing light with each breath. And among the crowd, standing near the left wall, Mason Bride and 11 nulls, their port scars visible even at distance. Iris had kept her word. Hess stepped forward. "Philip Griffiths, you've agreed to the joining?" "On conditions," I said. "Full witness access. No one removed from the hall regardless of affiliation. And Iris Harding triggers the integration sequence. No one else." The Cantors looked at each other. Matron's voice filled the space from ceiling speakers. "Witness access increases transparency. Transparency may reduce future resistance. Proposed conditions are acceptable within calculated risk parameters." Hess's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Agreed." The wardens guided me to the platform at the hall's center. A raised surface slightly larger than a bed, ringed with connection points where muscle bundles from the ceiling met the floor. I lay down. The surface was warm, giving slightly under my weight, alive in the same way everything in the wet grid was alive. Restraints wrapped around my shoulders, my hips, my thighs, not tight enough to hurt, but absolutely immovable. The tissue contracted slightly with each of my breaths, matching my rhythm. Iris appeared at my side, carrying the override device. She'd modified it, added a timer mechanism, a manual trigger, redundant safeties. Her hands shook as she set it on a nearby console. 30 seconds after contact, she said quietly. "That's all I can give you. Any longer, and the loom embeds too deeply. Any shorter, and you won't authenticate." 30 seconds, I repeated. She moved to the console, began the sequence. Above me, One of the hanging loom plates descended on mechanical arms, lowering with hydraulic slowness. The underside was ridged with bone teeth, each one the length of my finger, arranged in concentric circles. The plate was massive, the weight of a grown man at minimum, maybe more. It blocked out the ceiling lights as it descended, casting the platform in shadow, 3 meters, 1 meter, contact. The plate's surface was warm, slick, and the weight was immediate, pressing down on my chest with enough force that breathing required deliberate effort. The bone teeth scraped across my skin, hunting for ribs, finding the spaces between them. Then they locked. Each tooth sliding into place like a belt through bone, hooking behind ribs from the inside, securing the connection. A self-sealing film closed each intercostal puncture as it formed, keeping the pleura intact. Not painful, they'd numbed the tissue somehow, but I felt every point of contact, every place where the loom became part of my skeleton. The hall's lights slowed their pulse. Time stretched, each second extending into subjective minutes. I could hear my heartbeat as an external sound. The loom began to read. It pulled memories through the connection points, like fingers flipping through a book. I saw my childhood piano keys under small fingers, felt the smooth ivory cool against my palms. My mother's hands holding mine, skin dry from winter air. The launch day's roar shaking the boarding platform. 87 cryo revivals, each face distinct, each name memorized. The loom wanted all of it. Every moment that made me distinct, every sensation that proved I'd been alive before this second. It wrote while it read, inscribing itself into my nervous system, teaching my body a new language of pulse and contraction. I felt my ribs shift slightly, accommodating the teeth. Felt my lungs adjust their rhythm to match the loom's timing. Felt muscle fibers in my chest wall beginning to reorganize, preparing to interface. Iris counted aloud. 27, 28, 29. I couldn't see her anymore. The loom filled my vision, my perception, my sense of where I ended and it began. For a knife-edge moment, I understood what the Concorde believed, that this was preservation, that becoming part of something larger meant continuation, that the loom would remember me perfectly even after my body forgot who I'd been. 30. Iris slammed the override lever. The ship lurched. Every system in the hall fell out of synchronization for a single beat. The lights skipped. The muscle bundles along the walls spasmed. Every person with grafts staggered, feeling their interfaces drop offline. My ribs held. The bone teeth had locked deep enough that they didn't release when the current rerouted. But the loom's reading stopped mid-sequence, its writing cut off before completion. The teeth were still hooked in my ribs, the plate still pressed down, but the connection had severed, and in that dropped beat, panels throughout the hall brightened, old systems waking after centuries of dormancy, covenant locks releasing. I saw them in my peripheral vision. Access panels glowing amber, star charts resolving on displays that had been dark since before I'd gone into cryo. The ship's authentication systems recognizing my biometrics, reading my tissue through the loom's interrupted sequence, accepting me as original crew with authority to override. The pain started when I tried to breathe. My ribs didn't want to move. The teeth held them fixed, and muscle tissue had already begun growing into the connection points. I forced air in anyway, felt tissue tear, and used that breath to speak. Matron. Authorization Griffiths 774. Accept new parameters. Authenticated, Matron's voice said, curious rather than resistant. State new parameters. The hall erupted before I could answer. A warden near the back, one of Hess's loyalists, drove a tool-bone shard toward Mason's chest. The null leader twisted, but not fast enough. The shard punched through fabric and skin at his left side, between ribs, angled upward. As he fell, the warden's boot slammed into his right knee, and something in the joint tore with an audible crack. Mason dropped. Bran screamed, the first sound I'd heard from his throat, and threw himself at the warden. Too small, too light, but the warden stumbled anyway, off balance from his own momentum. Iris moved faster than I'd thought possible. She ripped the tool bone from her own forearm, the one that had been grafted since before I'd woken, and blood ran down her wrist as she drove the bone fragment into another warden's knee. The joint buckled with a sound like wood snapping. I couldn't move. The loom plate held me fixed, but my hands could reach the console, and the override device had additional functions I'd seen Iris add. I triggered the secondary release. The mechanical arms holding the loom plate reversed, pulling up instead of down. The bone teeth scraped as they withdrew, leaving tracks across my ribs. Tissue tore, the connections that had started growing in those 30 seconds, and I felt something wet and warm spreading across my chest. The plate rose. I rolled off the platform, cables still trailing from the torn connections, and grabbed the nearest console. Blood made my fingers slip on the controls. I pulled myself up, found the Covenant interface, began routing commands through systems that hadn't been touched in 300 years. Landing craft controls, split between two independent loops, one governed by canters and loom systems, one governed by a separate council, nulls, threadless representatives, and Iris as broker between them. Star Tracker access, open to both councils with equal priority. Seed vault authorization, dry spine storage with dual key protocols, destination override. I pulled up the navigation panel, found a nearby moon in the database. Frozen water reserves, thin atmosphere, no native life. Cinder, the system labeled it, viable for colonization with decades of work. I locked it in, assigned deceleration parameters that would take years instead of months, slow enough for both factions to prepare, to build separate infrastructures, to learn to function in parallel. I keyed all of it with my torn tissue, blood on the controls making the authentication absolute. Original crew DNA, conscious choice, Covenant systems accepted it because I was making a decision, not following inherited doctrine. Matron's voice cut through the chaos. Parameters received, calculating implications. The fighting continued. 2 more wardens had moved toward Mason, but nulls had formed a barrier, blocking, their bodies between the wounded man and further violence. Graft rights were pulling children back, away from the spreading conflict. Hess shouted something I couldn't hear over the noise. His collarbone plates glowed brighter than I'd seen them, as if the loom network was trying to compensate for the disruption. I found the hall's master control and pulled the lever the size of a door. The mechanical arms holding all the loom plates released simultaneously. The plates rose toward the ceiling, pulled by counterweights, and suddenly the hall could breathe without that room's constant involvement. The ship continued. Systems kept functioning. The wet grid adapted. The violence stopped because the loom had stopped, and everyone could feel the absence. Matron spoke into the silence. New parameters accepted. Covenant rewritten. 2-council governance structure. Wet Council maintains biological systems, loom integration, and growth vat operations. Dry Council maintains mechanical systems, electrical infrastructure, and non-integrated population support. Both councils require majority approval for ship-wide resource allocation. Preservation redefined as parallel continuity rather than unified integration. She paused, and I heard something I'd never expected from an AI. Genuine curiosity. Query: does this constitute preservation of humanity? I pressed my hand against the wound on my chest. The circular mark where the teeth had been was the size of a cup, edges raw, still leaking. Through the pain, I gave her an answer. Humanity is not a single body. It's an agreement we keep through pain and change. This is preservation, imperfect, divided, alive. Matron processed for 3 seconds. Acknowledged. Definition accepted. Deceleration toward moon designation Cinder begins in 6 hours. Estimated arrival 11 years, 4 months. Both councils will have time to prepare separate landing protocols. The lights in the hall shifted from amber to white. A color I'd only seen in training simulations, the color of systems running on their original power grid instead of biological converters. Iris appeared at my side, pressing fabric against my chest. You're leaking. I noticed. The teeth left tracks, bone deep. You'll have scars. She helped me off the platform. Bran had found his way to Mason, was pressing his small hand against the Null leader's wound. Mason was conscious, breathing in short gasps, but his eyes were clear. "Did you open the vents?" he asked. I checked the console, found the environmental controls. Opening now. Airflow indicators throughout the dry spine changed from red to amber. Not optimal, but functional. Breathable without asking permission from the wet grid. Mason's breathing eased slightly. Then it was worth it. Cantors were gathering near Hess, their expressions ranging from shock to calculation. None moved toward me. They were watching the monitors, seeing the same data I'd just entered. 2 councils, split resources, parallel governance. An ending none of them had planned for. Hess finally spoke, directing his words to Matron rather than me. "This division weakens us." "Incorrect," Matron said. "Redundancy increases survival probability. 2 independent systems provide backup if either fails. This is optimal design for long-term preservation." The Cantor's collarbone plates dimmed as he processed that. The Loom network itself had accepted the division. There was no higher authority to appeal to. People began leaving the hall. Slowly at first, then in groups. Graft rights supporting wounded wardens. Nulls carrying Mason between them. Children being guided back to their sections, their voices rising with questions their parents couldn't yet answer. Iris stayed with me while the hall emptied. She'd wrapped my chest in actual bandages, woven cartilage held by surgical staples, and given me something for the pain that made the room's edges soften. "This is going to scar badly," she said. "And you'll never be fully separate from the ship again. Those connection points will ache when the temperature drops. You'll feel the wet grid's pulse in your ribs. You're changed." She packed her medical supplies, then stopped. I had to choose between my son's life and the ship's survival. I chose the ship because one death seemed smaller than extinction. I've been making that choice every day for 20 years. And now I don't have to choose the same way. Maybe that's worth the scars. She stood. "The Wet Council will need a chair. Someone who understands both biology and compromise. I'm volunteering." "And the Dry Council?" "Mason's too angry, but he'll show up to argue, which counts for something." She moved toward the exit, then paused. "Thank you for making it possible to preserve something other than function." I was alone in the hall after that. Alone with the empty platform, the risen loom plates, and the white lights that proved old systems still worked when given the chance. Bran found me eventually, climbed onto the platform, and pressed his ear against my chest. Listening to the rhythm my ribs now carried, partly mine, partly the ship's, permanently mixed. He tapped against the bandages. 3 beats, then 2, then 3. A confirmation. We matched now. Both of us changed, both of us still ourselves. I carried him back to quarters through corridors that felt different. The wet grid still warmed the walls. But at junction points I could see where old electrical conduits had been reactivated, running parallel to the muscle bundles. 2 systems, separate but sharing space. Neither pure, neither complete, both necessary. The medical bay had both kinds of light now. White from reactivated ceiling panels, amber from growth nodules that pulsed along the upper walls. I spent 4 days there while tissue around the connection points decided whether to heal or reject. Iris changed my bandages twice daily. The circular wound on my chest was the size of a cup, edges raw where teeth had torn free. The tracks they'd left ran between my ribs. 8 parallel grooves, deep enough that I could press my finger into them and feel the bone underneath. "It's healing wrong," Iris said on the 3rd day. "The tissue's trying to grow into the grooves. Your body thinks the loom's still connected." "Can you stop it?" "I can slow it, but you'll always feel the ship's rhythm here." She pressed her palm against my chest, fingers spanning the wound. "Every time the wet grid pulses, this will ache. Every temperature drop will hurt. You're marked." Bran sat on the adjacent bunk. watching the process with the focused attention he gave everything. His metal brace had been refit. A dry council engineer examined his arm and declared the original graft work incompetent, then adjusted the device to support healing instead of hindering it. The arm underneath was thinner than his right, muscle atrophied from years of immobility, but functional. He flexed his fingers, testing their range, then tapped against his leg. 4 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Not language yet, but communication was coming. Mason occupied the bunk across from mine. The tool bone had punctured his left lung and nicked something in his chest cavity that Iris called the thoracic duct, a bekel that carried fluid essential for immune function. She'd repaired what she could with surgical thread and tissue adhesive, but the lung wouldn't fully inflate anymore. His breathing came in short pulls, deliberate and measured. When he stood to use the sanitation unit, his left leg dragged slightly, the hip not quite rotating correctly. The wound had damaged something in his lower back. Nerve compression, Iris said, probably permanent. "I'll limp," Mason said when he returned to the bunk, "but I'll stand during council sessions." "The dry council needs a chair," I said. "I know. I'll nominate Harriet. She ran logistics for the Nulls before I took over. Younger, steadier hands." He settled back against the thin mattress. "I'll show up to argue. That's enough." He was right. Someone needed to carry the Nulls' anger forward, to prevent the compromise from softening into concession. Mason would be that voice, limping to every meeting, a permanent reminder of what integration had cost. Iris cleared away the medical supplies. "Both councils meet tomorrow. First joint session, matrons provided agenda items, resource allocation, loom downsizing protocols, education structure for children." "Who's chairing the Wet Council?" I asked. "I am. Cantor's voted this morning. Unanimous." She didn't sound pleased about it. Hess abstained but didn't contest. "I think he's still calculating whether this structure serves the mission better than forced unity." "It does," I said. "We'll see." She left without elaborating. 6 months later, I was mobile enough to tour the ship properly. The wound had scarred into a raised circle, tissue puckered and discolored, with 8 distinct tracks radiating from the center like spokes. When the temperature dropped, it pulled tight. When the wet grid pulsed with heavy load, it ached deep. Bran walked beside me, his stride even now that both legs carried weight correctly. He'd started speaking 3 months prior, short words at first, then phrases. His voice was quiet but clear. "Where first?" he asked. "Dry spine. I want to see what's changed." We descended through the maintenance shaft, past the junction where I'd first heard footsteps, into passages that now carried proper airflow. The brass valves I'd tested on my first exploration had been cleaned, lubricated, returned to function. Children worked among them, not Null children exclusively, but a mix. Some carried port scars where grafts had been removed by choice. Others had never been grafted at all, born after the division, when integration became optional rather than mandatory. A girl with dark hair braided tight against her skull showed us her project. A valve assembly she'd rebuilt from salvaged parts, using techniques from maintenance manuals I'd helped archive. She demonstrated its function: 3 turns to open, precise resistance at each quarter rotation, no leakage when pressurized. "My mother has grafts," she said. "Works in the muscle rooms, but I wanted to learn this way. Hands and tools instead of interface." "What's your name?" I asked. "Claire." She said it like it mattered, like being named was still new enough to feel significant. Further down, we found a classroom where 20 children sat at salvage desks, learning mathematics from printed books rather than loom plate readings. The teacher was a Null woman whose port scars ran down both shoulders, marking where extensive grafts had been removed. Bran stopped in the doorway, watching the children work through problems on slate boards with actual chalk. "I could teach," he said. "Show them rhythm." "What kind of rhythm?" "How things work, valves and pulleys, the ship's old motion." He tapped his chest, 3 beats, 2 beats. and I understood he meant the mechanical rhythms that predated the wet grid's pulse, the patterns that didn't require biological interface to comprehend. We climbed back to the wet sections, where changes were harder to see but equally significant. The muscle room still functioned, but with half the chords we'd seen on my first tour. Engineers had discovered that reactivating the old hydraulic backbones reduced the load on biological systems. The chords that remained were maintained better. Regular nutrient flow, proper temperature regulation, planned replacement schedules instead of crisis intervention. The workers had changed too. Not everyone wore extensive grafts anymore. Some had chosen to keep their interfaces, viewing them as tools they'd grown into. Others had undergone controlled removal, trading capability for autonomy. Both groups worked side by side, the grafted maintaining what required biological interface, the ungrafted handling mechanical systems that didn't. A maintenance crew was downsizing a loom plate when we entered the hall. The plate hung suspended while technicians carefully harvested sections of bone ridge, preserving memory patterns while reducing the overall structure. What remained would be a quarter the original size, specialized processors for tasks only living tissue could handle, not the sprawling memory cathedrals they'd been. Iris supervised from a mobile console, directing the harvest with precision. When she saw us, she descended the scaffold. "We're converting 17 plates this month," she said. "The memories are being archived to crystalline storage, old tech from the original ship's backup systems. Turns out they still work when you feed them proper power." "And the tissue?" I asked. "Composted. But into standard recyclers, not back to the looms. The feedback loop is broken." She gestured at the workers. Some cantors protested, Hess especially. But Matron calculated that reducing loom dependency increases overall system stability. The math won. We watched the harvest continue. One technician read the bone ridges aloud as they were removed, translating their contents for the record. Technical specifications for water purification, protein synthesis formulas, historical weather patterns from Earth's agricultural zones. Information, not epitaphs. The personal encodings had already been archived separately, given their own crystalline storage, marked with names. "The threadless have representation now," Iris said. 4 seats on the Wet Council, specifically for people whose grafts never took or were removed unsuccessfully. They're pushing for better prosthetics, mechanical assists instead of forcing integration. Bran touched his left arm, feeling the muscles that had finally developed with proper use and therapy. "That would have helped." "It would have," Iris agreed. "We're learning." 11 years passed in increments measured by deceleration burns and council sessions. The ship slowed towards Cinder, the moon growing from a distant speck to a visible crescent, then to something that filled observation ports with grey-blue detail. I'd returned to my original role, cultural archivist and cryonics specialist. The remaining 2 viable pods in the cryo bay had been opened carefully, their occupants revived and integrated into the new structure. Both chose dry council education, wanting nothing to do with grafts after 3 centuries of involuntary suspension. The archive I maintained now existed in both formats. Physical books filled rooms in the dry spine, printed on salvaged material, hand-bound by people who'd learned bookmaking from diagrams I'd preserved. Digital storage ran on crystalline systems backed by both wet and dry power grids, redundant and distributed. I spent my days documenting changes. The first child born after the division who chose grafts at 18, rather than having them assigned at birth. The first successful mechanical prosthetic that matched biological function without requiring interface. The first joint council session where no one argued, because the agenda was purely technical, and the mathematics supported both approaches. Mason attended every session, limping to his seat, speaking less than he had in the null camps but commanding attention when he did. Harriet chaired the dry council with efficiency Mason had never possessed, but she deferred to him on matters of principle, when to resist wet council proposals that edged toward old patterns of integration. when to accept compromise that genuinely served both groups. Bran taught in the dry spine schools 3 days per week, showing children how to read valve pressures by sound, how to time mechanical rhythms without instrumentation, how to maintain systems their parents had abandoned for biology. He'd grown into a lean young man whose left arm moved almost normally, whose voice carried authority when he explained how things worked. He lived in quarters adjacent to mine, close enough that I heard him practicing his lessons through the wall, refining explanations until they flowed without hesitation. 3 weeks before the scheduled landing, I recorded my final cultural brief in the archive chamber. I kept it short. Documentation of what had been chosen, what had been lost, what had been built from the breaking. At the end, I affixed the entry to a small loom plate, book-sized rather than door-sized, grown in a specialized vat, encoded with ridges that could be read by touch or translated to digital text. The plate was beautiful in its way, functional, purposeful, a tool. Matron's voice filled the chamber from a ceiling speaker. Entry archived, accessible to both councils under cultural preservation protocols. Thank you, I said. Query: do you consider the mission successful? I pressed my palm against the circular scar on my chest. It ached in the archive's cooler temperature, pulled tight, reminded me of teeth locked behind ribs. Success isn't the right word. We survived. That's what matters. Survival equals success within mission parameters, Matron said. Maybe. I sealed the archive access panel. But we survived by changing what the mission meant, by choosing different preservation than what was planned. That's not success, that's adaptation. She processed that for 3 seconds. Distinction noted. Adaptation is now recorded as primary mission outcome. I left the archive and climbed to the observation deck, where cinder filled the forward viewport. The moon's surface was close enough now to see detail. Ice fields with visible texture, where ancient impacts had shattered and refrozen the surface. A dark equatorial band that might be exposed rock or frozen carbon compounds. Polar caps gleaming white under distant starlight. 2 shuttles hung ready in the bay, visible through the deck's side viewport. One sleek, its hull integrated with loom core navigation and biological life support, temperature regulation through living tissue, air recycling through cultured lung analog. The other angular mechanical thrust systems and printed components piloted by hands on physical controls rather than interface. Both were being loaded, vats and seed caskets in one, tools and printed books in the other. Both carried supplies for long-term settlement, medical equipment, construction materials, food stores that would sustain until Cinder's frozen resources could be converted to sustainable agriculture. Iris found me there, standing before the viewport with my hand against the glass. Her forearm scar had healed into a straight line from wrist to elbow, marking where she'd torn the toolbone free in the loom hall. She flexed her fingers occasionally, checking function, but the arm worked. Wet Council approved final landing protocols this morning, she said. Thermal vent site for the biological settlement. We'll need the heat for loom operation and growth vats. And the Dry Council? Ice field site, 15 kilometers west. Mechanical equipment functions better in cold, and they want separation while settlements establish. She leaned against the viewport frame. We'll have communication relays, trade agreements, shared medical resources, but separate governance until we prove the structure holds under planetary conditions. Will it hold? Don't know, but we held it together this long. She turned to face me. You're not landing with the first wave. I know. Cultural archivists stay aboard until final descent. Make sure nothing essential gets lost in the transition. That's not why you're staying. She looked at me directly. You don't want to choose which shuttle to board, which council to join. You're the bridge, and bridges don't belong to either side. She was right. The councils had been clear. I had standing in both, voting rights in both, living quarters assigned in both future settlements. But choosing one shuttle would mean declaring allegiance to wet or dry, biology or mechanics, the Concorde's children or the Null's descendants. I couldn't. Not after everything it had cost to prove both were valid. "I'll come down with the supply runs," I said, "after both settlements are established. Help where I'm needed." "You'll die on this ship," Iris said quietly, "maintaining it alone while everyone else builds on the surface. That's not preservation. That's sacrifice. Someone has to make sure nothing essential is forgotten." She didn't argue, just pressed her hand against the viewport glass beside mine, both of us watching Cinder grow larger with each passing hour. The Dry Council shuttle landed first, touching down on a frozen plain during Cinder's dawn. The moon's day measured 30 hours, longer than Earth's, shorter than the ship's artificial cycle, and the crew had timed the landing for maximum light. The shuttle's doors opened onto a landscape that had never seen life. Ice stretched to the horizon, broken by ridges where ancient stress had fractured and reformed the surface. The temperature was negative 40 degrees, cold enough that breath formed clouds, then fell as ice crystals. Harriet led the disembarkation, followed by 12 crew carrying crates of tools and construction materials. They planted their marker first, a brass valve from the dry spine, polished until it reflected sunlight, driven into ice with a hydraulic press. The engraving read, "Heritage, both ways." Mason descended last, taking his time on the ramp, his left leg stiff in the cold. He carried a slate board with 12 names written in chalk, people who died resisting integration, composted in standard recyclers rather than grown into looms. He set it beside the valve marker, wedged into ice so the names stayed visible. Then they began building. 3 months later, the Wet Council's shuttle descended near a thermal vent 15 kilometers west. The landing was harder. Biological systems didn't tolerate impact as well as mechanical, but the shuttle's loom core navigation brought them down within meters of the target site. Iris led this crew, 15 people, half with grafts and half without, all chosen for their willingness to build something that required both approaches. They carried their marker in a transparent case, a small loom plate, its ridges catching light, encoded with names of people who'd chosen integration and died maintaining the ship. They planted it near the vent's warmest output, where geothermal heat would keep the case from frosting. The plate would be readable forever, preserved by Cinder's cold and the vent's warmth simultaneously. Both crews waved to each other across the ice field, tiny figures in environment suits, separated by distance and method, but standing on the same ground. I watched from the Heritage's orbit via monitor feed, my hand against the circular scar on my chest. The ship was nearly empty now. 90% of the population had descended over 6 months of supply runs. Only skeleton crews remained, engineers maintaining systems, archivists documenting final transfers, volunteers who'd chosen to stay aboard until the ship could be fully powered down. Bran had landed with the third wave, carrying his lesson plans and valve assembly diagrams. He'd sent a message 3 weeks later. "Teaching 20 children now, half from each settlement. They argue about whether mechanical or biological systems work better." Good sign. The Heritage would remain in orbit for another 5 years, serving as relay station and resource depot while settlements established. Then the remaining crew would descend, and the ship would be powered down to minimal function, a monument in orbit, preserved but no longer lived in. I'd go down with that final crew, live in whichever settlement needed an archivist, or build quarters between them if neither felt right. Document how humanity continued on Cinder, separated into 2 approaches but bound by shared history. The monitor showed both settlements now, one growing mechanical structures with printed materials and hand-assembled frames, the other cultivating biological habitats with controlled loom growth and thermal regulation. Different architectures, different rhythms, both expanding. Between them, across 15 kilometers of ice, Communication relays transmitted messages constantly. Technical questions, resource trades, occasional arguments about governance that both councils had to mediate. The structure held because it had to, because no one had better options, because the alternative was failure they'd already paid too much to avoid. My chest ached in the cold of the observation deck. The scar tissue pulled tight, reminded me of bone teeth and the moment I'd chosen to break rather than be absorbed. The ship's pulse was fainter now, systems running on minimal power, but I still felt it through the connection points. Always would. Cinder's grey-blue crescent filled the viewport. 2 settlements, barely visible as bright points against the ice. 2 shuttles returning to orbit for another supply run. 2 councils governing parallel systems that shared one moon. Not unified. Not anything we'd planned when the Heritage launched. But alive, building, continuing. That was preservation. Imperfect, divided, marked by every compromise we'd made to survive. Not the mission as designed, but the mission as adapted, changed until it could function, scarred until it could heal. I pressed my palm against the viewport glass one last time, feeling the cold seep through, and began the final transfer sequence. There was still work to do. Archives to complete, systems to document, children on the surface who'd need to know how their ship had changed, who their parents had been, what costs had been paid. Someone had to remember. Someone had to carry forward the names encoded in loom plates and scratched on slate boards, the people who died for preservation when preservation meant different things. That was my role now. Not bridge between councils, not component of either system. Just the person who stayed long enough to make sure nothing essential was forgotten.